January 15, 1919, a wall of molasses 2.5 stories tall comes tearing down a Boston street at 35 miles an hour. Faster than a man can run. In under a minute, it is going to kill 21 people, crush a firehouse, and rip an elevated train off its own steel supports. And when the company responsible got caught, their first move wasn't an apology. It was to blame it on terrorists. 2 years earlier, a company called United States Industrial Alcohol threw up a giant steel tank right in the heart of Boston's North End. A packed, working-class Italian immigrant neighborhood with kids playing in the streets and families crammed into tenements just yards from the site. World War I had turned industrial alcohol, the kind you make from fermented molasses, into serious money, useful for explosives and munitions, and USIA wanted in fast before the war ended and the demand dried up. So they skipped hiring a structural engineer. They skipped basic pressure testing. A company that had never built anything like this before just started pouring concrete and riveting steel plates together as quick as they could, then began filling it, 50 feet tall, 90 feet wide, holding over 2 million gallons. Almost immediately, the tank started groaning. Not a subtle sound, a deep metallic moan that workers nearby joked about like it was an old ghost living in the steel. It leaked constantly too, so badly that neighborhood kids used to walk up with tin cups and scrape sweet molasses right off the outside wall for a free treat. One of USIA's own employees, a man who worked the site every day, went straight to his supervisors and told them plainly, this tank is not safe. Their actual fix was not structural. It was cosmetic. They painted the whole tank a dark brown, specifically so the leaks streaking down the sides wouldn't be so easy to spot anymore. That single decision, paint over repair, would end up defining exactly how this company handled every warning sign that followed, right up until the day the tank gave out completely. On the morning of January 15, 1919, the temperature had swung wildly, from a bitter cold snap just days earlier up into the low 40s, and a fresh shipment of warm molasses had just been pumped in on top of the older, colder batch already sitting in the tank. That kind of rapid temperature change puts real stress on steel, expanding and contracting it unevenly, right at the exact seams that had already been cutting corners since the day it was built. Just before noon, with the streets full of lunchtime workers, delivery drivers, and kids on their way home from school, the tank didn't just leak. It failed completely, all at once. 2.3 million gallons of molasses hit the pavement in a single instant, and witnesses described a wave more than 2 stories high, moving an estimated 35 miles an hour, fast enough that grown men sprinting flat out could not outrun it. It slammed into the support columns of the Boston Elevated Railway and buckled them like tin foil, dropping a length of track. It lifted an entire firehouse off its foundation with firefighters still inside. Horses working nearby got trapped up to their necks and suffocated where they stood. And unlike a flood of water, molasses does not just rush past a person and let go. It's thick, it's sticky, and in January cold it thickens even more by the second, meaning anyone caught in the open didn't just get knocked down, they got held there. 150 people were injured that day. 21 were killed, and some of them weren't found in the wreckage for days, because rescue crews had to dig by hand through molasses that was actively hardening in the cold, turning parts of the neighborhood into something closer to amber than syrup. Rescuers reportedly had to cut through debris with saws while literally standing knee-deep in it. Among the dead were teamsters eating their lunch, a boy who'd just come home from school, and city workers who had no reason to think a routine Wednesday would end like this. It took over 300 workers and firefighters to clear the worst of the wreckage, and cleanup crews eventually discovered that pumping in salt water straight from Boston Harbor was the only thing that broke the molasses down fast enough to actually clean the streets. Even decades later, old-timers in the North End swore that on a hot enough summer afternoon, you could still catch a faint whiff of molasses drifting up from the pavement. Here's the part that should make you genuinely angry. USIA's very first public move was not an apology, and it was not an investigation into their own tank. It was a story fed straight to the newspapers that anarchists had planted a bomb. And in January of 1919, That story actually had teeth. This was the height of the first Red Scare in America. Just months earlier, a well-known anarchist named Luigi Galliani had been giving fiery speeches across Massachusetts, and some of his followers had genuinely been building and detonating real bombs at other industrial targets in the region. The federal government itself was gearing up for nationwide raids on suspected radicals. USIA didn't invent the fear. They just pointed it at their own disaster and let it do their talking for them, spending over $50,000, an enormous sum at the time, hiring expert witnesses specifically to try to prove sabotage instead of admitting fault. For years, in the court of public opinion, that story mostly worked. It took the slow grind of a courtroom, not a headline, to actually undo it. It didn't hold up. A state investigation, followed by a massive class action lawsuit, one of the very first of its kind in American legal history, with over 100 separate plaintiffs combined into a single case, dragged the real story into the open over the course of 6 grueling years. A court-appointed auditor named Hugh Ogden personally reviewed thousands of pages of engineering testimony from both sides, and in April of 1925 he released his findings, blunt and unambiguous. The steel plates in that tank had been too thin from the very start. The rivets holding it together were spaced too far apart to safely handle the pressure of 2 million gallons. There was no bomb, there was no anarchist plot. There was only a company that built something dangerous, got warned about it directly by their own employee, and chose a can of brown paint over an actual repair. USIA was ordered to pay out roughly $628,000 to the victims and their families, somewhere around $8 million today. But the money isn't really the legacy here. Because of this single disaster, cities across Massachusetts and eventually the country began requiring that major construction projects be reviewed and signed off on by a licensed structural engineer before they could ever be built, not after something goes wrong. That rule, born directly out of a molasses tank in Boston's North End, is quietly still protecting people in buildings you have personally stood inside, and almost nobody walking past that spot today has any idea where it actually came from. Go there now and you'll find a small ball field and a modest plaque, nothing that hints at the fact that this quiet patch of Boston completely rewrote how America builds things. So next time somebody tells you a corner is fine to cut because nobody's complained yet, remember the North End. The complaints were already there, months before the tank ever failed, coming from the very people paid to work beside it every single day. The company just wasn't the one listening, and 21 ordinary people on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon paid for that silence with their lives. Follow Sourbud's Den for more real history nobody taught you.